Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Actuarial 101. My name is Jeff Papps. I'm Loggers Education and Outreach Coordinator. And today we're going to spend about 30 to 40 minutes just discussing how evaluation is calculated and going through kind of the details of how that works and how the cost is determined for you to fund your loggers benefits. But before we get into it, let's talk about a few housekeeping items. The first is questions. So if you have a question today, what I want you to do is on the Zoom dialog box, when you logged into the webinar, and you can now see my PowerPoint screen, at the bottom of that, there's a section called Q&A. So you can click on that and then you type in those questions. And then as the questions come in, I'll see them come in and I'll answer them at that time. If it's something that's more specific to your subdivision, I might follow up with an email or a call instead of answering it on the webinar. But a lot of times, most of the questions we're going to get on a webinar are good for the entire audience. So please feel free to type in those questions at any time throughout the presentation, and I'll be happy to answer them. And then again, I did talk a little bit about agenda, but we should go till about 2:45 today at the latest. But if we go a little longer, a little shorter, but I'm planning on about 30 to 40 minutes. Unless we get questions, then it might go a tad longer. Okay. So let's get straight into it. So first and foremost, let's talk about some, let's talk about what an actuarial valuation is. An actuarial valuation is a mathematical model. It's performed by an actuary, and I'm not an actuary, just so you know. I'm just someone that kind of interprets some of this stuff. But what it's designed to do, the valuation itself, is to estimate the cost of benefits. So in other words, it's designed to project out what the contribution rates that are going to be needed to pre-fund your benefits, because loggers by design is a pre-funded system. We're designed so that we're collecting contributions ahead of time. And we'll kind of get into detail about that here in just a minute. Okay. As well, along with estimating those costs of benefits and determining what that contribution rate and what you need to be, the contributions you need to be making to pre-fund those benefits, it also measures your progress as far as your funding goes. So in other words, how much do you have set aside in the trust to pre-fund or put in place, or do you have in the trust for the purposes of paying those future benefits that are owed to the employees at the time when they retire. That's what, when we talk funding progress, we'll get to that in a minute as well. But that's generally what that is. And then also it's analyzing the experience that has been had. And we'll talk about this generally when we get into kind of what I like to call the assumption versus experience calculation that's done annually when we do an annual valuation. Okay, but what generally it is, your valuation is a mathematical model. It's more or less a large scale projection of cost and measures progress and in the experience that has happened at the subdivision and in the economy as a whole. Okay, so some terms to know. First, let's talk about an actuary. So an actuary, not Jeff. An actuary is a professional who evaluates the likelihood of certain events and creates a plans to deal with those events. So in other words, what an actuary is designing to do is they are dealing with the probability of, say, retirement, pay increase, turnover, things of that nature, investment markets, cost of living adjustments. All those things are the probability side of things that the actuary determines. And then they set out a plan for preparing for those certain events. Okay. And that plan is included in that valuation. Actuarial accrued liability. So that's a term you'll see on your valuation. And you'll also see an unfunded actuarial accrued liability, which will be the next one we're going to talk about. Okay. But actuarial accrued liability is the present value of the promised pension benefits or pension obligations. So in other words, in today's value of dollars, how much is needed to fund the future benefits payable to the members of the system, in your case, your employees. An unfunded actuarial accrued liability So this is the amount of liabilities or promised benefits that are greater than the assets. So this is part of your valuation that you receive from us in July of every year, where we have your actuarial accrued liabilities, your actuarial accrued assets, and the difference between those creates an unfunded actuarial accrued liability. Okay, so in other words, the amount of dollars that you still owe to pre-fund those benefits at 100%. That's what that is. Actuarial assumptions. Okay, so actuarial assumptions are estimates used to forecast those uncertain events. So when the actuary is going to be using actuarial assumptions to help forecast some of those uncertain future events affecting the future benefits or costs associated to a pension fund. Things that would be included in this are like turnover, investment return, pay increases, overall payroll growth, and things of that nature are all going to be at play here. And Jennifer just asked, will you get a copy of the presentation? I'm recording the presentation, and I can send you the stack, Jennifer, the slide deck. So that's the actuarial assumptions are, again, those estimates that are used to forecast your future cost, and in every one of your valuations when we're determining cost, and some level of actuarial assumptions are being utilized. So the pension funding formula, this is generally how it works out. Okay, so loggers, when we're talking about the pre-funding component, the pre-funding component of the benefit is going to include contributions from the employer and the employee and investment return. Those added together is going to equal someone's retirement plus the expenses of running the plan. Okay, that is how pension funding works. Is you're going to take in contributions from the subdivision. We're going to grow those contributions with investments. That's going to equal out paid benefits plus the expenses of running the system and also investing the funds. Okay. So when I said loggers is a pre-funded system, this is kind of what we're getting at. This is actually something that we've sort of stolen from our actuaries' comprehensive annual actuarial report, or the consolidated. I'm sorry. So what that does is this is just going to be an illustration of just generally how a pre-funded plan works. So on the left, it's percentage of active member payroll, and then the axis on the bottom is illustrating time. Okay. So as benefits rise, as the cost of benefits rise, if you were a pay-as-you-go plan, your cost would increase. Okay. So pay-as-you-go benefit plans, one that is most commonly that we all know of is Social Security. It is, turnaround for that's about 5 or 6 days. Funds go in, funds go out. And the cost of benefits as the group of retirees increases, and as the benefit amounts, in other words, the amounts that are being paid out of the fund increases, the contributions from the subdivision increase. That is not how loggers operates. Loggers instead is what's called a pre-funded plan, meaning we're going to be accumulating assets prior to someone's retirement, so that by the time someone is eligible to retire, the assets necessary to fund that benefit are already in the trust. So when you don't have anyone retired, we're actually collecting a larger amount of contributions than what you have as far as benefits being paid out, so that by the time when those lines cross of level contributions and benefits payable, that the funds necessary are already in the trust, and then there isn't any significant fluctuation in contribution rates. So the goal of loggers, one of the goals of loggers funded policy is to keep your contributions as level as possible, and this is primarily one of the best ways to do that is to be collecting funds in advance of folks' retirement, so that the actual retirements and benefits being paid out don't have a adverse effect on your contribution rate. So what this also allows is when you're making those level contributions over time, it gives the ability for investment income to make up the difference between what you're contributing and what we're being paid out in benefits. Right now, over about a 5-year average, I believe the number is around 67 cents or maybe it's 68 cents of every dollar that we have in the trust today has been paid for by investment return. So that's gives you kind of the idea. It's like you collect these level contributions, we invest the funds, we grow the funds over time so that you're still making those level contributions, but then the investment income is able to make up the difference between what you're contributing and the benefits we're paying out. And that's kind of the state that the system's in at the moment. And that's also just one of the things that we very much utilize when we're thinking of calculating benefits, is keeping that level contribution as level as possible. And there are some provisions in place that help protect and keep your contributions very level. Okay, so the actuary establishes a contribution rate for you based on information from loggers as far as the fund itself and the employer. So these are kind of all the data points that are being utilized when calculating an annual valuation by loggers actuary. Okay, so the personnel data from the employer. In other words, have you had any turnover, salaries, head count, all those sorts of things. Okay, employer asset data. So how much have your assets grown through your contributions and things of that nature are all going to be something that play an impact on your when we're calculating out the valuation. Loggers benefit option data. So in other words, what options you have chosen from the menu of benefit options that you can choose from for your loggers benefits, that's going to have an impact. Obviously, the higher the level of benefits, the higher the cost. Okay. And then assumptions, of course. So the assumption data is going to be played in. That all is factored into the actuary. And then the actuary uses all of this data to calculate a valuation report. So what I typically like to say at this point is they do an assumption versus an experience calculation every year. So every year on the last day of February, loggers actuary looks back 12 months to the first day of March. And from that 12-month window from the last day of February, they look at a number of different assumptions that are built into the cost. And they say, here's what we assumed would happen. And here's what did happen. Now, it's not a full year to year, like investment return. We smooth that over 5 years. There's some things in there that aren't exactly year to year, but some are. So just generally speaking, we look back at that 12-month window and we say, here's what we assumed and here's what happened. Anything that, and that's going to create things that are called actuarial gains and actuarial losses. Actuarial gains typically result in a lower contribution rate for an employer overall. And actuarial losses typically trend to upward trends in contribution rates. So a number of those assumptions that are built in, there's some that are demographic and there's some that are economic. So demographic is like members that leave employment. If you have turnover and you have someone who's not vested and they leave employment and they never return to covered employment again, you've made contributions to the trust. Those assets stay in the trust because they have to. The IRS code tells us it has to. Unless it's their contributions. They can always take their contributions back, but your contributions to the employer stay in the trust. Well, those funds aren't assigned to anyone anymore, so essentially they get spread out across the pool. That happens on a recurring basis. That can be a long-term actuarial gain for a subdivision. Disabilities for members, retirements for members are some data points that could have an impact. Salary increases. So if you've done significant salary increases, and I know if I did a show of hands, a whole bunch of people would raise their hands because lately that's been a common trend. Is over the last couple of years, a number of our subdivisions have done significant salary increases to try and remain competitive within the workforce. And those salary increases, while they obviously increase the dollars you're contributing to loggers, they're also going to have a long-term implication on potential upward contribution rates for loggers because those increases were in excess of what we expected to happen. Okay. Mortality. So if folks are living longer or shorter than expected, that's going to have some impact. Some economic components to the valuation: price inflation, wage inflation, payroll growth. So payroll growth and wage inflation, you may think those are the same thing. They aren't. Wage is individual, payroll is overall. Okay, each one of those are assessed separately. And investment return. So investment return is the one that we can most commonly understand. So we'll use that as kind of an example with some more like real statistics, real data. So on a long-term basis, Loggers assumes a 7% return on investment. And what we do is year to year, we're going to take an investment return amount and we're going to divide it up over 5 years. This is called actuarial smoothing. Now, this smoothing component, what it's going to do is it basically, with the peaks and valleys that are the investment market, it more or less makes it more gradual ebbs and flows with investment returns. So with that smoothing included, if Loggers were to post a higher than 7% return on investment, that's going to yield a lower contribution rate generally. Okay, if on the longer term, if we're producing a below 7% return on investment, that's going to yield typically higher cost for our subdivisions. So that's generally what's being done at every single annual valuation. They're looking back at all these different data points. They're saying what was kind of out of balance, then adjusting the contribution rate to ensure that that the necessary funds to pre-fund the plan are being placed and being contributed. So sometimes we got a really great investment return, so we don't need you to contribute as much because those returns produce more than we expected. Sometimes it's you didn't give a pay increase as high as expected. Sometimes it's you had more turnover than we expected. All those sorts of things are going to have some impacts on your cost. Okay. So the employer's contribution rate will depend heavily on the agency's personnel. So personnel can have a significant impact on this. I mean, economics are the ones we use because those are the ones for us to really understand. And honestly, the most significant risk to a subdivision is investment return. If Loggers long-term doesn't produce what it needs to produce in investment returns, then what's going to happen is you're just going to continue to see upward trends in contribution rates. But long-term, we've been able to. I mean, our 5, 10, 15-year marks are well in excess of 7% and they're near 9%. They're in the upper 8% somewhere in there. And that's a really great position to be in because, from an employer perspective, you're going to be, you could see trends of long-term level contributions when we're producing a strong investment return number. So, but generally, when we talk about payroll groups, especially for smaller subdivisions, this can have a significant impact. Your contribution rates, generally speaking, are going to be higher if you have experienced, high salaried, and seniored employees. Okay, so if your employees are closer to retirement, they're within 10 years of retirement. So they're and when I say experienced, that means they have a lot of service credit. Okay, so they have a lot of service credit, meaning their benefit's going to be large. They're a higher salary earner, and they're closer to retirement. Typically, that's going to trend your contribution rate north. Okay, if you had some turnover that occurred, and maybe a couple of those folks retired, and maybe you were 100% funded, so then the asset transfers happen, and then you hire a less experienced, lower salaried, younger workforce. Typically that results in a lower contribution rate. Now, there's a lot of things that are at play here. I mean, we just talked about in the previous slide, all these different things that are calculated into your cost, right? So, just to say that if I have experienced, higher salary and older folks, then we're going to have higher wages. And then if we just, retire them all and then we hire the younger folks, they're less experienced, then our cost is going to go down. That's not necessarily how it works. But generally, on a generality, if you have a more experienced workforce, your cost is typically going to be higher than if you have a younger, less experienced workforce and you've had significant turnover over the years, and your workforce continues to stay in a less seniored level. Okay. So contribution rates. This is one of the components of the cost. So we talk about valuations and how all these things are done with assumptions and all this, and that's all that's all something that's included with that valuation. But primarily, the biggest thing that you care about is your contribution rate. So what are you contributing to loggers year to year? So what happens is the actuary calculates out all of these different contribution rates based on all of the actuarial assumptions and asset data and all those things and funded level, all those things play into it. But what we do is we add 3 different contribution rates together. So we calculate out these 3 separate contribution rates. We add them together, and that ends up being your total employer contribution rate. Okay, so if you're looking at your valuations, which you can find on Eclipse if you want to, they're under agency details. You click on profile, find the valuations tab. Every valuation from 2011 until now should be there. And you can look at, assuming you've been in the system since before 2011, some of you may be newer than that. But those will all be in there. And if you go to page 13 in that valuation, that's where the contribution rates are. Okay. Also, if you're looking at on Eclipse and you go to your rates tab, that has all of your contribution rates in it. Each one of these individual rate types are separated out on there and added together to make your total. But let's explain what each one is. Okay. So I'm going to focus on the 2 bottom ones first, then we'll talk about prior service cost. Okay. Normal cost, also called current cost. Your normal cost is the pre-funding component of your contribution rate. So loggers by design, remember we said, is a pre-funded plan, meaning we're collecting contributions now for benefits payable in the future. We're not waiting until they get to that future point and then collecting it. So what it does is it's paying for that current year of service for the current group of employees. And normal cost is going to change very little year to year, barring any benefit changes or significant payroll changes. So by that, I mean, if you have a whole bunch of folks that retire, or if you have a very young workforce, then all of a sudden those young folks quit, aren't vested, and you hire a bunch of folks that are more seasoned and a little older, then in that case, the normal cost could have fluctuation. But barring anything odd, normal cost should not fluctuate year to year very much, 10th% here or there. Casualty costs. So every one of loggers' subdivisions shares in the cost for duty-related disability or death benefits. So just in case you didn't know, what happens when someone leaves due to a duty-related disability or death benefit with loggers is we extend service credit to the person as if they had worked until the age of 60. Even if their retirement age is 50, we extend it to the age of 60, okay? Now, there's a cost for that. So say it's a 30-year-old employee, we're extending 30 additional years of service credit that have not been pre-funded through a current cost, right? Not through their normal cost, right? So what happens is all the assets necessary for that extension of service credit on a duty-related disability or death are drawn from the casualty reserve fund, okay? And the casualty cost, what it does is it's paying for and pre-funding those unexpected events and pooling that risk across all of our 840 subdivisions. Okay, this cost only changes if the board decides to adjust those, or if an employer makes a benefit change. Then sometimes it goes up because the amount of funds that we might be drawing from a casualty reserve fund due to those 2 potential payments could be larger with a higher level of benefits. When the board would decide is typically the last time they made an adjustment to that was during an experience study, where we found that that by department, police department, fire department, that those departments that are in higher risk fields are more likely, more prone to have those sorts of duty related disability or death payments due. So they made adjustments where it was actually segmented by department. But that is the only time that they would make that, and when they make those is typically if there's anything out of balance, like if we're not receiving enough into the fund, or if we're receiving too much into that fund. It's just all based on how the fund is performing from a funded level perspective. Then finally, prior service cost. So prior service cost is going to include a lot of different things. It will include the cost of the original employee's prior service. So if you are an employer that's been in the system less than 30 years, when entities join and they cover a certain level of prior service, we amortize that prior service over a 30-year closed period, and it is included in your actuarial accrued liabilities. Okay, so that cost would be included in that prior service cost. It would also include any sort of benefit enhancements, because benefit enhancements are retroactive. So when you do like a multiplier change from say the 1% to the 1.25% multiplier, all of the prior service of the employees from their hire date until the benefit change date is retroed to the higher level. So because of that, that creates a liability that gets amortized over a 20-year closed period, not 30, but it is also included in that prior service cost. In addition, the other thing that's at play in your prior service cost is adjustments based on the year to year. And so it's an annual adjustment based on the actuarial gains and losses. So remember when I said the actuarial gains and losses that happen year to year during the valuation cycle, those are all going to be amortized over a 15-year closed period. So you can see how complex the amortization can get, but over a 15-year closed period, and every single year we're amortizing those gains and losses. And the reason it's included in the prior service cost is because those adjustments are made based on the activity that happened in that prior year. So all of those are added together. Your prior service cost, your normal cost, and your casualty costs are all added together to equal your total employer contribution rate, which is what you would pay to loggers as a percentage of total gross payroll. Okay. That was a whole lot on that one slide. Hope you guys are hanging on. So then the other component, just so you kind of know, this is an example of an employer. It's actually the City of Independence in July of 15. But this is an example of evaluation that's sent out, and they're issued in July of every year. So annual valuations show the employer's next, not necessarily next fiscal year, but so basically the way they're issued is like this. So it's in the first, it's in fiscal years beginning in the next calendar year. So in this case, like this July 1 of 15, this was issued in July of 2014 for their fiscal year beginning on July 1 of 2015. Okay. So we give 6 months notice. That's what statute requires. So most of you all are getting it. Well, the statute, excuse me, let me reel that back just a bit. Statute requires that we give 6 months notice, which is why we issue in July, because the lion's share of our subdivisions are January 1 fiscal year dates. Okay, so give that 6 month notice in July for that contribution rate beginning in January of the next calendar year. So if in this case, in July of 14, it'd be January of 15. Okay. But there's some folks like Independence and others that have fiscal years that begin on different dates other than January 1st. So you're getting more than 6 months advance notice. If you have a July 1 fiscal year, you're getting a year in advance. If you have an October 1, it's like 18 months in advance. So that's how we're going to issue those valuations annually each July, and they're going to go into effect in your fiscal year beginning in the next calendar year. The one other component that's a protection for you. So we've talked about investment smoothing generally, and that's something that is a real good a real good procedure that is utilized for your valuations to help smooth out the risk of investment return. Because again, what we do is we take the investment return number and we divide it up over 5 years. So great gains or losses or somewhere in the middle, you're going to be dividing those up over 5 years, so that if there is, a big gain, well, you're going to experience that gain over 5 years divided up to help maybe offset a future not so great investment year, right? Because that's what the markets do. They just go up and down. Okay, so that's one protection. The other protection that's in place when we're calculating out your cost is statute. So this also includes that on this one. So according to the revised Missouri state statute, it's subsection 70.730. What it states is that loggers cannot increase your contribution rate by more than 1% in a given year. Okay. So in this case, you could see that that independents had some uncapped contribution rates. If you don't know, if you have one or not, what you're going to do is you're going to look at the last on your page 13 of your valuation. That's what this is. There's a paragraph at the bottom that will say under section 70.730, and then it will show you what your calculated uncapped contribution rate is. Essentially what that's stating is if this 1% was not in place, your contribution rate would be these contribution rates stated below. Okay. But the highest it can go in a given year, the next year is 1% higher than what your 1% of total payroll higher than what you're paying today. Okay. So those are the two protections that are in place, the investment smoothing and state statute. So that's pretty much generally how the valuation process works. What happens is basically, from the back end of things and from a detail side of things, on February 28th, well, March 1st, we start sending over data to the actuary regarding your payroll, regarding benefit elections, asset data, all that stuff that we talked about in the beginning. And we start sending that information over. They begin calculating out your annual valuations. Usually they're pretty deep in it in April and May. And then logger staff goes through and does a review initially in usually sometime in the second, third, fourth weeks of June. And then we'll send you a notice, an email notice, and usually it's on June 30 or July 1st that says annual valuations are available. And you can access them on Eclipse, and it gives you the instructions on how to access those. So just keep that in mind. But that's it on the details. So a couple things just to talk about from pension funding, generally speaking. This is more of like on the aggregate of a couple of different things. So there was a study that was done by the National Association of Retirement Plan Administrators, or something along those lines, NASRA. And what they did was they kind of came up with some common characteristics of well-funded pension plans, and loggers fits into all of these characteristics. So let's kind of go into a few of the details here. So some common characteristics of a well-funded pension plan is an amortization policy and practice that reduces unfunded liabilities in a timely manner while minimizing volatility. Okay, so the 1% cap kind of minimizes some volatility. The investment smoothing minimizes that volatility, as well as the amortization of liabilities being on a closed amortization means that you will, in a long-term approach, but you will at some point have any of that unfunded liability paid off, assuming you don't have any odd changes or benefit enhancements and things like that that can occur. Okay, so that's one of the couple of characteristics that are in play. A couple other characteristics: regular receipt of actuarial determined contributions. So state statute requires that all of our subdivisions pay into loggers and that they make their full required contributions. So as far as receipt of that, we're getting that, but I think it's more like the partnership that our employers have and the value that they understand that this plan brings to their ability to recruit and retain public servants in Missouri. They fully understand how valuable that is, and they willingly pay that contribution, although there is statute authority that requires them to. Okay, actuarial assumptions that align with experience. So we have a process in place called an experience study, where our actuaries and consultants all and our board all get together and they discuss a number of the assumptions and see if there was anything that was out of whack over the last 5 years, and if there's anything that needs to be adjusted in the future to ensure that we're collecting contributions appropriately. and that we aren't, you know, over assuming or under assuming in a certain area. We're trying to get as close to reality as possible so that your contributions remain as level as possible. And that's that's one of the procedures that's in place is every 5 years. It's automatic. It happens every 5 years where the board will go through an experience study process where where the actuary and our consultants and the board all sit down and have have an in-depth study on exactly what has happened with our assumptions, if there's anything that needs to be adjusted, and then the board adopts those changes as they see necessary. Another very common characteristic is as far as the well-funded pension plans is flexibility within the plan design or financing. And I think that's probably one of the things that Loggers does very, very well is all of the different options that you have to choose from as a subdivision for your benefits. You can increase them, you can decrease them, you can have employees contribute to share in the cost. And all those things are all things that you have control over on a local level. And having that flexibility allows for employers to not only elect benefits that best meet their goals, but elect benefits that can best fit into their financial constraints that they may or may not have. So that's another common characteristic of a well-funded pension plan. And all of those things we just covered are all things that Loggers has some sort of approach or policy or procedure in place that ensures that we are a well-funded pension plan, which brings us to our funding. Overall, on a system level, we are at a very strong funded, or very strong funded pension plan. And from that perspective, if you don't know what a funded ratio is, I'll explain that to you really quick. Funded ratio is a measurement that pension plans use to measure their solvency and in other words, measure their ability to pay benefits. And any funded ratio that's 80% or higher is considered to be a strong, well-funded pension plan. Okay. Another way to look at a pension plan is how many dollars do we have on hand versus how many dollars do we owe in the future. Okay. So currently Loggers is 96.5% pre-funded. A way I like to look at that is if all of our active employees, all 38,000 of them, were to no longer be employed with our political subdivisions, and all of our political subdivisions were to hire no one else. So in other words, no more active employees, no more local government in our state. All of our employees all of our members were to no longer be active members any longer. We could pay 96.5 cents of every dollar that we owe today. But we don't owe every dollar today because the plan, doesn't allow 30-year-olds to draw a benefit. It allows 55 and 60-year-olds to draw full benefits. So those are all things to be considering, but Loggers ranks in the top 5% of pension plans of our size and our complexity as far as funded level goes. So it's a really good testament to how good of a plan this is and how well funded it is, and just the groundwork that the folks that founded this plan way back in 1967 that they laid for the plan to become well funded and a great tool and resource for you. So that's all I have. I don't have any other questions that have come in. So if you do have questions, go ahead and type them in. I'll give you guys a couple more minutes. But if you've got to go, thanks for coming. I hope you guys found this to be beneficial and hopefully learned a little bit today. I know it was a lot, but I threw at you guys, a lot of detail. But if you do have any questions or if you need anything from us, feel free to give us a call or email us. We're happy to help with any question that you have. But I will go ahead and leave the webinar open here for another couple minutes just for folks to type in questions. But if you've got to go, thanks for coming, and I hope you guys have a great and happy holidays. Danielle, if you still have a question, can you type it into the Q&A or the chat? If you're still here. If you're not still here, that's fine. Feel free to email me. Hey, Danielle. Yeah, so you asked, you just wanted to confirm that if you contribute for an employee and they leave employment, that the funds that you contributed on their behalf remain in the fund. And the answer to that is yes. They essentially become an actuarial gain for your cost for future valuation purposes. Now, if you are requiring contributions to 4 or 6%, the funds that the employees pay in is still their funds. So they can take those funds with them when they leave if they want. They don't have to, but they can. And Katie, yeah, I'll send you I think I'm just going to send everybody who attended a copy of the slide deck and a link to the video. All right, looks like most folks are leaving, so I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar at this point. But I do appreciate everybody for coming, and be on the lookout for an email here by next week with the link to the video and a link to the slide deck. If you do have any other questions for us, feel free to reach out. We're happy to help. Thanks a lot, and have a great day.